It was the winter of 1976. I'd been on the Hoffa thing 6 months. 6 months, and I was no closer than I'd been in August. The folder on the desk had gotten thicker. The list of what I knew hadn't. Here's what I knew. July 30th, 1975. A Wednesday afternoon. A suburb of Detroit called Bloomfield Township. The parking lot of a restaurant called the Matchus Red Fox. A man stood in that parking lot waiting for a meeting. His name was Jimmy Hoffa. For most of 2 decades, he'd run the largest labor union in America, the Teamsters, 2.5 million members, every truck on every road. When Jimmy Hoffa told men to stop driving, the country stopped. In 1975, he was out of the job and trying to get back in. A lot of people didn't want him to. The meeting didn't happen. At 2:15, he called his wife from a payphone to say nobody had showed up. By 2:45, he was gone. His car was still there, unlocked. He wasn't. Nobody saw him leave. Nobody saw where he went. 6 months later, they still hadn't found him. 200 FBI agents, 6 cities, 70 volumes of files. No body, no arrests, nothing. That's what everybody knew. What was bothering me was what everybody didn't. 3 things had been bothering me since the first week. The 4 letters on the calendar. Why did he write them down? A man who'd spent his whole life being careful about who he met didn't need to write it down. Unless he wanted somebody to find it. The salmon in the back seat. I'd read the interview 4 times. Nobody cuts up a 40-pound fish in a borrowed car in July. Nobody cleans salmon blood at a car wash. And the phone call, the one to his wife at 2:15, what he said, what he didn't. The girl at the front desk set a folder on the desk and left. She'd stopped saying anything weeks ago. 56 pages. The Bureau had been putting it together for months. Somebody had leaked it to me. I'd been waiting. I turned to the first page. It was still raining. It had been raining for a while. Somewhere in those 56 pages was the answer, or most of it. I just had to find it. Start at the beginning. But the beginning wasn't July 30th. The beginning was a man, and a job, and a couple of decades that ended in the wrong place. Hoffa ran the Teamsters for 10 years, and he ran them hard. He made enemies everywhere it was possible to make them. In Washington, in his own union, in the kind of rooms where enemies eventually become something worse than enemies. In the late 60s, he went to federal prison for jury tampering. Nixon let him out in 71 with one condition: no union activity until 1980. By the summer of 75, he was telling anyone who would listen that the minute the ban came off, he was taking the union back. A lot of people didn't want him to. Those were the people he was going to meet on Wednesday afternoon. Saturday, July 26th. A dinner. 3 men at a table. Hoffa, Anthony Giacalone, Anthony's brother, Vito. The dinner had been arranged by a friend of Hoffa's, a man named Louis Lenteau, who ran a limousine service in Pontiac, and who, in one of those late career reversals that happen between men who used to hate each other, had become Hoffa's unofficial appointment secretary. At that dinner, the Giacalone brothers told Hoffa there would be another meeting on Wednesday. A sit-down. Tony Jack, Anthony Giacalone, would mediate. Tony Pro would be there. Tony Pro was the reason Hoffa had stopped sleeping well. A man he'd done prison time with. A man he'd come to blows with inside the prison. A man who, the last time they'd spoken, had threatened to kill his grandchildren. His name was Anthony Provenzano, New Jersey Teamsters boss, Genovese family capo. But what mattered was what had happened in prison, and Hoffa hadn't forgotten. He didn't like Tony Pro, but he trusted Tony Jack. And Tony Jack was the one who'd made the offer. Hoffa went home and wrote 4 letters and a time and a place on his office calendar. TG, 2 p.m. Red Fox. I looked at that note for a long time. TG for Tony Giacalone, 2 p.m. for the time, Red Fox for the Matthews Red Fox. A restaurant in Bloomfield Township where Hoffa's son had held his wedding reception. Hoffa had chosen it. Hoffa had liked it. He'd written it down. That's the part I kept coming back to. Jimmy Hoffa had spent 40 years of his life in rooms where you don't write things down. A man who had run the Teamsters for 15 years does not need a reminder that he has a 2 o'clock. But he wrote it down. And 4 days later, a dozen FBI agents were standing in an office, reading those 4 letters and trying to figure out who they were supposed to be looking for. Wednesday, July 30th, 1:15 in the afternoon. He left the house. His wife, Josephine, watched him go. He drove his 1974 Pontiac to Louis Lanto's office in Pontiac. Lanto wasn't in. Hoffa left word with the boys at the limo service that he was meeting Tony Jack at the Red Fox at 2 and that he'd be back in an hour. He arrived at the Matthews Red Fox a little before 2. He stood in the parking lot. There's a photograph somewhere of him standing there. It was the last one anyone took. At 2:15, he walked over to a payphone and called his wife. He said nobody had shown up. He said he'd wait a few more minutes. He said he'd be home soon. That was the last anyone heard from Jimmy Hoffa. By 2:45, he was gone. By 2:45, the parking lot was empty of him. His Pontiac was still there, unlocked. He wasn't in the restaurant. He wasn't at the payphone. He wasn't anywhere. Nobody saw him leave. Nobody saw him arrive at wherever he went. Nobody saw him at all. The photographs were in a folder on the top of the cabinet. I couldn't reach it on my own. The girl at the front desk pulled it down without being asked and set it on the desk next to the memo. She walked back out. I'd never been to the Matthews Red Fox. I'd seen photographs, dark wood, leather booths, a lot of Italian on the menu, the kind of place where men in suits ate lunch in 1975, the kind of place where nothing was supposed to happen. Hoffa stood in the parking lot for somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes, alone, waiting. Nobody came. Tony Jack was sitting at the Southfield Athletic Club 30 miles away, in full view of witnesses, getting a massage. Tony Pro was in New Jersey playing cards with a man named Stephen Andretta. Both of them had iron alibis for the exact 2-hour window in which the man they were supposed to be meeting with disappeared. When you see alibis that clean, you don't think, oh, what a coincidence. You think somebody built these alibis. At 7 the next morning, Josephine Hoffa called her son and daughter. Jimmy hadn't come home. He hadn't come home the night before. She hadn't been able to sleep. At 7:20, Louis Lanto drove to the Matthews Red Fox and found the 1974 Pontiac sitting in the lot, unlocked. He called the police. By the end of the day, the FBI was involved. By the end of the week, there were 200 agents on the case, in Detroit and in New Jersey and in 4 other cities. The files were stacking up. A labor leader doesn't just disappear from a suburban parking lot in broad daylight without somebody somewhere knowing something. In this case, somebody somewhere knew everything. Several somebodies. They just weren't going to tell anyone. I went back to the photographs. The Pontiac in the lot, the restaurant behind it, a lot of empty space. The boys from the bureau had walked every inch of that parking lot, measured it, diagrammed it. They had tire impressions, scent tracks, witness statements from every waitress and busboy and patron who'd been at the Red Fox that afternoon. They had everything, and they had nothing, because the one car in the parking lot that mattered wasn't the Pontiac. It was a car that hadn't been there 10 minutes before. That was there for maybe 4. And then was gone. A truck driver saw it leave. He nearly hit it pulling out of the lot. He gave the Bureau a description. Maroon, new, 1975. A Mercury Marquis Brougham. That was the car I needed to follow. Back to the four letters. TG, 2 p.m. Red Fox. There's a school of investigator who think every detail means something and every detail is a clue. I've never been one of those investigators. Most details don't mean anything. A man writes down a meeting on his calendar because that's what people do. But Jimmy Hoffa wasn't people. And to understand why he wrote those four letters down, you have to understand the money. The Teamsters had a pension fund. Hoffa had built it, $1 billion by the mid-70s, sitting there. Over the years, a lot of that money had quietly walked out the door toward mob-connected construction in Las Vegas. Hotels, casinos, a whole desert economy funded on trucker pensions. I set the pacifier down. I thought about $1 billion. Frank Fitzsimmons, the man who'd had Hoffa's job since he went to prison, wasn't the type to ask where the money was going. Hoffa, if he came back, was. That was the problem. And then there was Tony Pro's personal problem. The grandchildren, the threat, the prison fight. Hoffa had told Pro he'd tear his heart out, and Pro was not a man who forgot that kind of thing. That kind of conversation doesn't really end. So you might say, well, he didn't distrust Tony Giacalone. You'd be right. He trusted Tony Jack. Tony Jack was the reason he was going, but Tony Pro was going to be there too. And he did not trust Tony Pro. And if the meeting went wrong, if Tony Pro did something, Hoffa wanted there to be a record that he had gone to the Red Fox to meet TG. Not Tony Pro. TG, he was leaving a trail. Not in case things went well, in case they didn't. Hoffa trusted one man at that meeting. He was right to. Tony Giacalone wasn't in that parking lot. Tony Giacalone was 30 miles away getting a massage. And he was wrong too, because Tony Giacalone being 30 miles away getting a massage was not an accident. Tony Giacalone had built himself a clean afternoon, a massage, a steam, witnesses, a receipt, a whole airtight day out of a man whose schedule rarely involved alibis. The appointment was the alibi. The appointment was made to be missed. I picked the pacifier back up. I looked at the four letters. TG, 2 p.m. Red Fox. He'd written it down, not for himself, for whoever would be going through his office on Thursday morning. The trail was the only thing he'd get to leave behind. I pulled the file on Chucky O'Brien, not his blood son, not his real son, his foster son. Hoffa had raised him from a boy, but Chucky's mother had been close to the Giacalones, and Chucky had called Tony Jack Uncle Tony since he was a kid. And by 1975, the Giacalone side of the family had won. Charles Lenton Joseph O'Brien, 41 years old, the one who'd grown up with one foot in each world and had made his choice. On the morning of July 30th, O'Brien borrowed a maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis Brougham from Joseph Giacalone, Tony Jack's son, with license plate TMS 416. He said he borrowed it to deliver a 40-pound salmon. I've read a lot of alibis. This was not one of the better ones. O'Brien said he drove the salmon over to somebody's house, cut it up, brought the car back, took it to a car wash afterward because there was salmon blood in the back seat. Nobody cuts up a 40-pound fish in the back seat of a borrowed Mercury Marquis Brougham. Nobody cuts up a 40-pound fish in the back seat of any car. Fish is cut in kitchens, on counters, over sinks, not in car seats in July in Michigan. But Chucky O'Brien said he did, and Chucky O'Brien kept saying he did. Every time the Bureau came around, every time the grand jury convened, the salmon, always the salmon. The problem with the Salmon: the Bureau brought in trained police dogs. They gave the dogs clothing Hoffa had been wearing the day before. Shirts, a jacket, familiar smelling things. The dogs sniffed the mercury. The dogs hit, loudly, on the back right seat. And then they found a hair, a single human hair. In the back right seat of a car that Chucky O'Brien had driven the afternoon Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. The hair was Jimmy Hoffa's, the Salmon. The Bureau described O'Brien in the memo as a habitual liar. They said it in writing. They said it because they had to say something, and what they wanted to say didn't fit in a memo. What they wanted to say was this: somebody picked Jimmy Hoffa up from the Red Fox in that Mercury. Somebody Hoffa knew. Somebody Hoffa would have gotten in a car with. Somebody who, afterward, washed the car, invented a fish story, and stuck to it. Chucky O'Brien was the theory. He was the theory for a long time. He was still the theory on the page I was reading. But he wasn't the only one. 56 pages, January of 1976. Prepared for an internal bureau briefing in Washington. 6 months of work, 4 cities, 200 agents, all of it compressed into 56 pages. It named 12 suspects. Before I go through them, one thing about the world these men belonged to. The mob in 1975 wasn't one thing. It was a map. Different families in different cities, each with its own territory, each with its own rules, all of them holding each other in check. For a hit on somebody Hoffa's size, no single family could move alone. Permission was needed, from multiple cities, from multiple men, which is how you end up with 12 suspects in 6 different states. At the top of the list was Tony Pro, the one who'd threatened Hoffa's grandchildren in prison. Age 58, New Jersey, Teamsters Local 560, Genovese family capo. The Bureau believed Tony Pro gave the order, but they didn't believe he'd given it alone. The order, they believed, came down through a man named Russell Bufalino, a Pennsylvania mob boss senior to Provenzano. Because taking out a former president of the Teamsters was not the kind of thing Tony Pro could have authorized on his own. You don't kill a man like that without permission from the people above you. The men who actually did it, the Bureau believed, were a New Jersey crew. Salvatore Briguglio, known as Sally Bugs, his brother Gabriel, Gabe Bugs, a man named Thomas Andretta. His brother Stephen had supplied the alibi for Tony Pro. The Bugs brothers, the Andretta brothers, Tony Pro giving the order from New Jersey, Bufalino sitting on top, and, on the ground in Bloomfield Township, somebody Hoffa knew, somebody Hoffa would get in a car with. The memo's theory for that role was Chucky O'Brien, an unwitting dupe, they called him, used because Hoffa wouldn't enter a car with the Bugs brothers in it, but would enter a car if Chucky was driving. I took the pacifier out and set it on the folder. I needed both hands for this. 12 names typed on a page. 12 men who the Bureau believed, with a certainty they were careful to qualify but could not hide, had killed Jimmy Hoffa or helped kill him or stood nearby while he was killed. 12 names. Nobody had been charged, not one of them, not for this. Some of them had been charged for other things. 6 of the 12 were either facing unrelated indictments or already doing time for unrelated crimes. Provenzano was being worked for the 1961 murder of a man named Anthony Castellito, a man who had disappeared 14 years before Hoffa. Same pattern, different year, but for Jimmy Hoffa, for the man whose hair was in the back of a Mercury Marquis Brougham in July of 1975, whose Pontiac sat unlocked in a parking lot for a whole afternoon and night, whose wife watched him leave the house at 1:15 and never saw him again. For that man, not a single person had been charged. Not a single person stood trial. People who know don't talk. That's the rule. The first rule of the world Jimmy Hoffa walked into at 23 and walked out of 52 years later. The people who knew didn't talk. And the people who might have, the ones the Bureau was leaning on, the ones getting close to making deals, had a way of not making them. Back to the 2:15 call, the last 3 minutes of Jimmy Hoffa's life that we can account for. He'd been in the parking lot for 15 minutes. The meeting hadn't happened. Nobody had shown up. He walked over to a payphone. He called his wife. The transcript exists only as Josephine Hoffa's recollection of it, given to the Bureau the following day. But she was consistent on the essentials. He said, "Nobody's here." He said, "I'll give it a few more minutes." He said, "I'll be home soon." He did not say, "Something's wrong." He did not say, "I'm going to leave." He did not say, "I'm in trouble," which tells you one thing. At 2:15, Jimmy Hoffa was annoyed. He was not afraid. A man who thought he was in danger wouldn't have stayed. A man who thought the meeting was a setup wouldn't have called his wife to say he'd wait a few more minutes. Hoffa stayed because he expected the meeting to still happen. He expected Tony Jack to turn up. He expected this to be what he'd been told it was. An ordinary sit-down that he was annoyed about being late to. Somewhere between 2:15 and 2:45. The meeting did happen, just not the one he'd been told to expect. A car pulled into the lot, the maroon Mercury Marquis Brougham. The driver was Chucky O'Brien, or somebody close enough to Hoffa that Hoffa would walk over. Whichever one of them it was, the rest of the car was full of men Hoffa did not want to get in a car with. The Buggs brothers, Andretta. But the man at the wheel was somebody Hoffa knew, somebody Hoffa trusted enough to walk over to the car and lean in. And then, and this is the one thing the Bureau believed they could prove, Hoffa got in the back seat. The hair, the scent, the back right seat. These are not theories. These are physical findings. A trained dog's nose, a forensic lab's hair analysis. Jimmy Hoffa got into the back seat of a maroon Mercury Marquis Brougham at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon on July 30th, 1975. The truck driver saw the car leave. Nobody saw where it went. Between 2:45 and whenever Hoffa was killed, an hour, maybe two, somebody was driving a car. Somebody was following orders. Somebody was taking a man who had been one of the most powerful labor leaders in America to a place from which he was not going to return. Every step of it was known to somebody: the driver, the route, the destination, the method, the location of the body. Nobody had said a word. There's a photograph in the file of Jimmy Hoffa standing in the parking lot at the Matchus Red Fox. 2 o'clock, July 30th, 1975. It's the last one taken of him. I put it face down on the desk. I wasn't ready to look at it again yet. I needed a break from the file. The case waited. The case didn't end in the winter of '76. I kept the file on my desk. I kept it there a long time. In March of 1978, Sally Buggs was shot to death on a street in New York City. 2 men walked up to him outside a restaurant, shot him 3 times, walked away. He'd been preparing to cooperate with prosecutors, or the people around him had been worried he was preparing. In that world, the distinction had never mattered much. In 1982, Jimmy Hoffa was officially declared legally dead. The date chosen was July 30th, exactly 7 years after his disappearance. His family had waited the legal minimum. In 1988, Tony Provenzano died of a heart attack in a federal prison. He was serving a life sentence for the Castellito murder. The Hoffa case had not been the one that got him. One by one, the rest of them went. Tony Jack Giacalone, Russell Bufalino, Billy Giacalone, Thomas Andretta, Stephen Andretta, Gabe Braguglio, in his 80s, still telling reporters he had nothing to do with it. Chucky O'Brien, in Florida, still saying it was the Salmon. The searches continued. A Detroit house, floorboards torn up. Not his blood. A horse farm in Michigan, nothing. A field in Oakland Township, nothing. A landfill in Jersey City under the Pulaski Skyway, nothing. A tip from a mobster. A deathbed confession from a landfill worker. A theory about a ballpark in Milwaukee based on a clue on a playing card. All of it. None of it. The body has never been found. I closed the memo. I sat with it for a long time. There are cases that end. There are cases that close. And there are cases that just stop being worked. The file stays open. The agents retire. The suspects die. The witnesses die. The family waits. The body doesn't come back. Jimmy Hoffa walked out of his house at 1:15 on a Wednesday afternoon and got in his car and drove to a suburban restaurant and called his wife from a payphone and got into the back seat of a borrowed Mercury Marquis Brougham and was never seen again. We know most of what happened. We know the meeting was a trick. We know the alibis were built. We know the car. We know the hair. We know the names of 12 men who the Bureau believed, with something close to certainty, participated in his death. We don't know where the body is. We don't know, not for court, not with proof, who gave the order and who held the gun. We know, but we don't know. The file closed the way files close. Not clean, just closed. Case closed. End of script.